to spend a very long, very quiet time drifting through the corridors of imperial China. We aren't here for the Great Wall or the grand battles. No, we're looking at the strange, quiet, and honestly quite baffling world of the inner court. Specifically, the era-defining obsession with the Golden Lotus. It's a story of how a literal physical deformity became the ultimate status symbol for the elite, and how being an emperor's favorite meant paying a price that most of us can't even fathom. It's tragic, it's weirdly specific, and it's perfectly suited for a long night of historical wandering. So let's just float back to the Tang Dynasty and see where this all began. It's often said that fashion is pain, but the history of foot binding really takes that sentiment and pushes it into a realm of pure, dedicated absurdity. To understand why 1,000 years of women would willingly, well, willingly is a strong word when your social survival depends on it, undergo this, we have to look at the Tang Dynasty around the 10th century. Legend has it that it all started with Emperor Li Yu. Now, Li Yu was a poet, he was a romantic, he was also, by most accounts, not particularly great at the whole ruling an empire thing, but he was very good at appreciating aesthetics. He had a favorite concubine named Yao Niang. She was a dancer, and she was apparently so talented that Li Yu wanted to create a stage worthy of her. He built a massive 6-foot-tall lotus flower made of solid gold, decorated it with pearls and expensive silks, and asked Yao Niang to bind her feet with white silk ribbons to make them look like crescent moons. She danced on the tips of her toes inside this golden lotus, and the emperor was so smitten that every other woman in the court looked at their own perfectly functional feet and thought, well, I guess these are obsolete now. Because of course they did. If the emperor likes tiny moon-shaped feet, then tiny moon-shaped feet are what you get. It's the classic royal domino effect. One person does something slightly eccentric because they're a literal monarch with too much time on their hands, and suddenly an entire civilization decides that walking normally is just a bit too mainstream. Now, at first, this wasn't the bone-crushing process it would eventually become. In the Tang and early Song dynasties, it was more about wrapping the feet to make them look slender and pointed. It was a look, a bit like wearing 5-inch heels today, except you never got to take them off. But as we move into the Song dynasty, things started to get, for lack of a better word, intense. The Golden Lotus wasn't just a nickname for a dance stage anymore. It became the standard. 3 inches. That was the goal. If your foot was 3 inches long, you were a Golden Lotus. 4 inches, you're a Silver Lotus. 5 inches or more, well, you might as well be wearing clown shoes at that point, at least according to the polite society of the time. You have to imagine the social pressure here. If you were a girl born into a high-ranking family, your feet were essentially your resume. Your face mattered, sure. Your family's wealth mattered, definitely. But your feet? Those were the proof of your discipline, your status, and your eligibility for a life of leisure. And I use leisure in quotes because, as we'll see, being an elite woman in the imperial circle was less about relaxing and more about being a highly decorated, very stationary piece of art. The irony, of course, is that this practice started at the very top. It was a mark of the ultra-elite. If you didn't have to work in a field, if you didn't have to walk more than a few steps from your bed to your sedan chair, then you didn't really need feet that worked, did you? It was the ultimate flex, as the kids say today. It said to the world, I am so wealthy and so protected that I don't even need to be able to stand up properly. It's a very strange way to show off. But then again, European royals were busy wearing lead makeup and gargantuan powdered wigs that gave them neck sores, so I suppose humans just have a historical habit of making themselves as uncomfortable as possible in the name of prestige. Let's look at the life of a typical young girl in the Song dynasty elite. Around the age of 5 or 6, the process would begin. Usually, it was the mother or a grandmother who did the binding. And this is one of those dark, ironic twists of history. The very person you loved most was the one tasked with breaking your bones. Why? Because if they didn't, you wouldn't get married. And if you didn't get married in 12th century China, your life was essentially over before it started. It was an act of cruel kindness. The process was slow, methodical, and incredibly quiet. They would soak the feet in a mixture of herbs and animal blood, usually goat's blood, to soften the skin and bones. Then the toenails were clipped back as far as possible. And then came the silk bandages. The 4 smaller toes were bent downward and pressed into the sole of the foot. The arch was forced upward, literally breaking the bones of the foot to create that crescent shape. And then they would make the girl walk. Because why not double down on the discomfort? The idea was that walking on the bound feet would help the weight of the body crush the bones into the desired shape. It's the kind of thing that makes you want to go back in time and give everyone a very stern lecture on ergonomics. But at the time, this was just Tuesday. This was preparation. This was the high price of admission to the world of the favorites. As the girl grew, the bandages were tightened every day. The goal was to stop the foot from growing while the rest of the body did. This resulted in a very specific way of walking, the lotus gait. Because the heel and the ball of the foot were basically pushed together, women had to take tiny, mincing steps. They had to sway their hips to maintain balance. To the men of the imperial court, this was considered the height of grace and eroticism. It was dainty. To anyone looking at it with a modern lens, it was a literal slow-motion disaster. But in the context of the Forbidden City, it was the gold standard of beauty. Consider the life of an empress or a high-ranking consort. She would spend her days surrounded by luxury, silk tapestries, jade carvings, the finest teas in the world. But she was also a prisoner of her own status. She couldn't go for a walk in the gardens without being supported by 2 servants. She was a delicate bird in a very expensive, very gilded cage. And the emperor? He loved it. The frailty was the point. It made the women seem ethereal, like they belonged to a different world, a world where the laws of physics and biology didn't quite apply. But behind the silk slippers, which were often beautifully embroidered with flowers and butterflies, the reality was much more grounded and much more grim. Infections were rampant. If the bandages were too tight or the skin wasn't cleaned properly, things got bad very quickly. But an empress favorite couldn't complain. To complain was to be ungrateful. To be ungrateful was to lose favor. And in the imperial court, losing favor was often a fate worse than physical pain. You'd be sent to the cold palace, the place where forgotten concubines lived out their days in silence and neglect. So you smiled, you swayed, and you pretended your feet didn't feel like they were held in a permanent vice. It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? We think of the great empires as being built on the backs of soldiers and laborers, and they were. But at the very center of it all, in the heart of the palace, there was this other kind of labor, the labor of maintaining an impossible image. The practice of foot binding lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It survived dynasties, invasions, and social upheavals. It only really started to fade away in the early 20th century. Think about that for a second. We have photographs of women with bound feet. This isn't ancient, dusty history. It's practically contemporary. It lingered because it was so deeply woven into the idea of what it meant to be a lady. Eventually, even the commoners started doing it, because everyone wants to look like the elites. Even if you are a peasant who needed to work in the field, you might bind your feet a little bit, just enough to hope for a better marriage for your daughter. It became a viral trend that lasted 10 centuries. If that isn't the ultimate testament to the power of influencer culture in the imperial era, I don't know what is. So, as we float further into the night, just imagine the silence of the inner palace, the smell of incense, the soft clinking of jade ornaments, and the sound of tiny, hesitant steps on polished stone. It was a world of immense beauty built on a foundation of immense quiet suffering, all for the sake of a golden lotus, all for the sake of being the favorite. But China wasn't the only place where the elites were making questionable choices for the sake of a look. If we head over to Europe, we find a different kind of disaster, one that wasn't about the feet, but about the blood.